En el lanzamiento del doctorado en comunicación, el doctor Eric McLuhan nos invitó a actuar de manera decidida como protagonistas y no como espectadores en la construcción de una nueva sociedad en la que podamos convivir de manera crítica con las tecnologías de la información. Uno de sus 3 hijos, Andrew, lo acompañaba en los viajes académicos que realizaba, entre ellos el que lo trajo a nuestro país para actuar como ponente central en el acto de lanzamiento de nuestro doctorado en comunicación. Tanto Andrew como su madre y sus 2 hermanas nos han apoyado en el propósito de recordar el nombre de Eric McLuhan, incentivando, entre otros, las actividades de las que él se ocupó, entre ellas cultivar el estudio, la investigación y la pasión por las letras. Escuchemos entonces a Andrew McLuhan. Pueden encontrar su discurso en las carpetas que les entregamos traducido al español. Bienvenido, señor McLuhan.
Muchas gracias. And thank you very much for that very wonderful tribute. Greetings and good afternoon. As I begin, I must first thank Dr. Obdulio Velázquez Posada, president of this great university, along with Manuel Gonzalez, dean of the Faculty of Communication, for bringing me here for the first Catedra Eric McLuhan. Also, on behalf of my mother, sisters, my wife and children, and all our family back home, I must thank them and the wonderful staff, some of whom are friends now and even family, for the remarkable support I was given when I was here last year and my father unexpectedly died the day we were to leave Bogotá. The night before, he delivered one of the most important speeches of his career, Media Ecology in the 21st Century, his strongest statement and his last word on the direction he felt our study of the effects of technologies had to turn. It was a message of courage and hope, and his words have given me much strength over the last year. When my father, Eric McLuhan, spoke last May to those gathered to mark the launch of the new doctoral communication program here at the Universidad de la Sabana, he was excited. He was excited because of the great opportunity he saw. The field of communication and media study is still rather new. Like anything else, we tend to follow the marked trail, the well-worn path. My father and his father Marshall before him considered themselves not simply travelers but explorers. Rarely content to take the established route, they were constantly and actively seeking new ways, new things, the road less traveled, and the unexpected. The media landscape is constantly changing, and so are people. In North America and elsewhere in the world, the methods of studying technology and its effects on people and societies, though relatively new, are well established. Much of what is done has more to do with the content of communication and less to do with the form, the effect. He saw, with the new doctoral program in communication and media study on its lovely Chia campus here, positioned as it is within a tradition, but also as a newcomer, a great opportunity for a fresh start. In my time here today, I will range over the lives and careers of Eric and Marshall McLuhan with a bit of myself thrown in order to give you a sense of who they are, the nature of their work, and also to hopefully add something useful to the topic at hand, political speech in the age of social networks and big data. If it seems random, please bear with me. Hopefully, it will all come together. My grandfather, Marshall McLuhan, was one of the pioneers of this field, one of the first to start looking into the psychic and social effects of human technologies. Several things set his approach apart. It surprises many to learn that Marshall McLuhan was, for his entire career, a teacher of English literature, specializing in 20th century poetry. His early writing focused on literary criticism, book reviews, and the like. But even back then, and in his student work, one can see the direction his interests and studies would take. His study of culture and technology would seem a bit off to the side of that, but it was a direct result of his own studies in literature and literary criticism. One of the things which made Marshall so brilliant was his ability to take seemingly unrelated subjects and use them to inform each other. This is a literary device known as metaphor. His stroke of genius was to take the tools he'd been taught in England at Trinity College, Cambridge University, and to turn them to the study of technology. This would come full circle in the last book he and his son Eric worked on together, Laws of Media, the New Science, which showed that all human technologies are as words, that they behave like and may be studied like words. Laws of Media began as a project to revise Understanding Media for a 10th anniversary edition. In the early 1970s, Marshall and Eric set out to address one of the main critiques of Understanding Media, that it wasn't scientific. They decided to explore whether it could be treated scientifically, that is, were there any universal laws when it came to how human technologies behaved and their effects? They found 4 properties of all human technologies, things which all media did in all cases, which they called the tetrad of media effects. Eric McLuhan lays out the story of exploration in his introduction to the 1988 first edition. Another discovery Eric McLuhan made when putting the book together in the 80s was that in searching for a new science, they had stumbled upon an old science. He subtitled the book The New Science to draw a direct reference to Vico and Bacon, and he considers Laws of Media to be the 3rd book of a trilogy with Scienza Nuova and Novum Organon. Back at Cambridge, Marshall was most influenced by I.A. Richards and F.R. Leavis, who had developed a new method of literary criticism called practical criticism. 2 most important books from them are Practical Criticism and Culture and Environment. A revolutionary approach, practical criticism took away the content distractions of any piece of writing to focus solely on the effect it has. Instead of asking, what does it mean? Practical criticism asks, what does it do? What is the attendant audience? What is the intended or otherwise effect? Indeed, practical criticism can tell you everything about a poem except whether it's good or bad. This caused quite a stir at the time. In likely one of the most significant moments of the 20th century, Marshall McLuhan took that method out of the study of literature and turned it to the study of culture and technology. Here are a few of the things which set Marshall McLuhan's approach apart from the more conventional ones. Over his career, when thinking about and speaking about the psychic and social consequences of technology, Marshall was careful to avoid judging them in terms of whether a given thing was good or bad. When you make a decision like that, it becomes difficult to look at a thing objectively, to focus only on what it does, the effect it has. It distracts. When you talk about a thing, he would say, people assume you are in favor of it. In my case, the opposite is almost always true. He said he was like a guy who pulls a fire alarm. I didn't set the fire, he would say. He was just telling everyone that the building was on fire and we might want to do something about it. A global warning. Similarly, he didn't identify as a theorist. I have no concepts, he said, only percepts. In his book, Theories of Communication, Eric writes, it's a matter of how you begin. If you begin with a theory, then one way or another, your research winds up geared to making the case for or against the truth of that theory. Begin with the theory, you begin with the answer. Begin with observation, you begin with questions. This theme of probing, of exploration, runs through McLuhan work from the early 1940s right through the entire of Eric McLuhan's work and the end of his speech here last year when he said, "You are launching a new vessel into an adventure, an exploration. Much of what you will see and do is new." In the strongest possible way, he told us to have courage, to be daring, but above all, to have courage. Marshall McLuhan's studies at Cambridge in literary criticism prepared him to look at the effect of a poem aside from its meaning, to evaluate it on everything but whether it was subjectively good or bad. And when returning to North America for a teaching position in the United States, he encountered students he couldn't relate to, he didn't understand. He turned to their popular culture, to their advertising and comics, to understand who they were and what made them that way. The result of this study was a popular class in a book in 1951, which would set the stage for his life's work in probing the effects of our technologies, The Mechanical Bride, the Folklore of Industrial Man. I hope you're beginning to see the relevance to the topic at hand, political speech today in our age of social networks and big data. We are confronted with a new situation, one difficult to understand. I am suggesting we might approach it the way Marshall would. In 1962, Marshall McLuhan published The Gutenberg Galaxy, The Making of Typographic Man. In the same year, Rachel Carson published The Silent Spring. Carson's book blew the lid off the effects of industrial pollution and gave birth to a new awareness and an environmental movement which lasts to this day. The things she was talking about then have become only more obvious and consequential today, and so with McLuhan's work. Around the same time, Marshall was working on Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man, first published in 1964. In it, he wrote a chapter entitled, The Medium is the Message, bringing that idea to the world at large, though he actually first said it earlier in the 1950s. The book created quite a stir with its unconventional style. The first chapter opens, in a culture like ours, long accustomed to splitting and dividing all things as a means of control, it is sometimes a bit of a shock to be reminded that, in operational and practical fact, the medium is the message. This is merely to say that the personal and social consequences of any medium, that is, of any extension of ourselves, result from the new scale that is introduced by each extension of ourselves or by any new technology. He goes on to illustrate that idea several different ways through the first chapter in his effort to shed light on this basic tenet of media study. Not long after publishing Understanding Media, Marshall began to use the word environment interchangeably with medium. In 1966, in a new introduction to the second edition of Understanding Media, Marshall wrote, "The section on the medium is the message can perhaps be clarified by pointing out that any technology gradually creates a totally new human environment. Environments are not passive wrappings, but active processes. The medium is the message means, in terms of the electronic age, that a totally new environment has been created." In 1970, in an article titled Education in the Electronic Age, Marshall wrote, "It is perfectly clear to me that all media are environments. As environments, all media have the effects that geographers and biologists have associated with environments in the past. The medium is the message because the environment transforms our perceptions, governing the areas of attention and neglect alike. Ecology does not seek connections, but patterns." A year after that, in 1971, Marshall McLuhan wrote to his friend Ashley Montagu, "More and more I feel compelled to consider causation as following from effects. That is, the effects of the telegraph created an environment of information that made the telephone a perfectly natural development." Let's pause and allow that to sink in. If you'll indulge me, we'll take a break from Marshall for a few minutes to talk a little bit about Eric McLuhan. Thomas Eric Marshall McLuhan was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1942, the eldest child of an eventual six. Marshall was at the time teaching at St. Louis University. Several years later, Marshall got a job at Assumption College in Windsor, and soon after his position at St. Michael's College within the University of Toronto, where he spent the bulk of his career. Eric was the firstborn child, the eldest son of an English professor and devout Catholic, and he was raised in kind. It was a conservative household full of serious intellectual activity, but also laughter and fun. My father was schooled and brought up in a very traditional manner. In the last year, I have been spending Tuesday nights in my father's library, making an inventory of his books, these tools which he used in his work. In the course of that, I've come across all sorts of interesting and wonderful things, but also some surprising things, some things which have made me see my father in a new light. I was not a great student myself. I had lost interest in school by about grade 4, and by grade 10, I was failing half my classes, barely passing the other half. I know it's hard to believe. I eventually turned it around when I decided I wanted to at least graduate high school and found, to everyone's surprise, that if I just sat down and did the work I was asked to do, instead of daydreaming, drawing, playing music, and writing poetry, I could fairly easily get A's and B's. For me, my father had long been the scholastic standard, the ideal, the very model of a scholar. This was a man who, later in life, retaught himself Greek so that he could go back to the earliest texts of Aristotle in research for his 2011 book, Media and Formal Cause. He felt that the translators had gotten it wrong, and there was only one way to prove or disprove that. He was a man who worked alongside and with Marshall McLuhan, who Marshall considered an equal, a partner, a co-author, an explorer. A man who, when his father died, also young and unexpectedly, picked up the mantle and dedicated the rest of his life to his very last day to carrying the torch, so that we might better see and understand our world. In that time between Marshall's death in 1980 and his own death in 2018, he finished and published such important McLuhan works as Laws of Media, the New Science, Media and Formal Cause, Theories of Communication, and more. He was responsible for bringing forward many essays and articles by Marshall McLuhan and was instrumental in having Marshall's PhD thesis, The Place of Thomas Nash in the Learning of His Time, published, a most impressive, important, and overlooked part of Marshall McLuhan's work. The Nash thesis looks at the history of the trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic from their inception in ancient Greece through to the 19th century. In that time, Eric also followed his own pursuits. His own thesis on James Joyce's book was published, The Roll of Thunder in Finnegan's Wake. He published Electric Language, Understanding the Present. He worked with his friend Wayne Constantino, a mime trained by Marcel Marceau in Paris, on a series of books called The Human Equation, which is a study and revelation of the processes of human innovation, illustrated through the human body. He followed his own peculiar and fascinating interests in Egyptology and wrote a book on ancient Egyptian art, his take on which is so revolutionary that no one would publish it, so he left that for me. Thanks. He did all these very impressive things, books, degrees earned in honorary, awards, and so it was a shock to me to find some old report cards from his grade 9 and 10 where he wasn't doing well at all. And there were his father Marshall's comments on them to his instructors, telling them how disappointed he was and to do with Eric as they saw fit. At first I was shocked, and then I was smiling when I realized that at least in this our stories were similar. He had also lost interest in school as I had, but he had more than turned it around. He had become a highly respected scholar, had made some very important contributions to scholarship, and had changed many lives along the way, including mine. As you might imagine, it can be a bit intimidating being the son of Eric McLuhan, a grandson of Marshall McLuhan. It's a lot to live up to if one chooses to attempt to do so. There are the expectations of others, the expectations of oneself, and doubts all around. But finding that report card, which wasn't exactly hidden away, it was in plain sight in his library, finding that report card was a wonderful thing. It told me the man who I admire and respected so much, who I held to this impossible standard, well, he and I were more alike than I imagined. Eric graduated high school and almost immediately enlisted in the U.S. Air Force. As a U.S. citizen, he was eligible for the draft to Vietnam. He had a lifelong love of airplanes, making models since he was a kid, and he wanted to change, so he joined the Air Force. Something happened. While he was in the States, he was working toward a bachelor's degree. He came back to Toronto and started working with his father, joining him in Harley Parker when Marshall was awarded the Schweitzer Chair in the Humanities and taught at Fordham University for a year. Eric taught classes and edited the Dewline newsletter. He went on to get his master's and doctorate in English literature. He turned it around. He worked his butt off, and he did remarkable and impressive things, and when his father died, he carried on. That's the thing which has worried me most the past year. He's no longer there to answer every little question I have. But he and Marshall have left so much behind for us all to help us continue their work and their legacy. He believed in me, that I had it in me too, and I have to tell you that has warmed my heart the past year. While I couldn't claim to be of Eric or Marshall's caliber, my father and I have to this point, and in some but not all ways, similar stories. I also went away for a few years and came back, though I hadn't earned so much as a single credit toward any kind of degree then or since. In taking on a job of inventorying Marshall McLuhan's library, I became interested in the work in a deep way, and for once, it started to make a bit of sense. In the 18 months I spent exploring and documenting his library, which Eric McLuhan had inherited, I got to know Marshall and his work in unexpected ways. By immersing myself into the 6,000 or so volumes of his library, his working tools. And I began traveling with my father on speaking trips, at first for necessity because he needed someone with him to make sure he didn't get into diabetic trouble, or if he did, that someone was there who knew what to do. But through conversations on long trips, sitting in on his talks and classes, I discovered that I was both interested and increasingly able to follow what he was talking about, something that wasn't the case in earlier years. A little understanding goes a long way. It is, in its way, addictive. You want to know more, and you want to share it with others. It was an immense privilege to spend that time with my dad, an immense privilege to have that much of his attention and tutelage. I can only hope that I paid enough attention and trust it was enough to see me through as I try to carry on. It was the time of my life. Right up to last May with media ecology in the 21st century, when my dad either had the courage he urged on others or simply didn't have the inhibitions holding him back to give his strongest statement on media ecology and show us all a way forward. All of that was to give you a bit of background as to the kind of person Eric McLuhan was, the kind of scholar he was, and to give you also a bit of my story and my place in this tradition. In 2018, my father was addressing mainly teachers and faculty. I am a student. Hopefully the stories I've told will have some meaning for students here. This year, today, the Universidad de la Sabana is welcoming another group of students as it begins the second year of its doctoral program in communication. It has bestowed a great honor on my father, my family, in naming this the Catedra Eric McLuhan. Political speech in the age of social networks and big data is a worthy topic, and one I've avoided so far, at least directly, with my words. I've been attempting to address it from the margins all along. A few learned people will follow me shortly with valuable perspectives in the subject. So rather than offer my own opinions and address it directly, I will offer some perspectives which will hopefully shed some light on the matter. In the teacher's guide, which came with the 1977 book by Marshall McLuhan, Catherine Hutchin, and Eric McLuhan titled City as Classroom, Understanding Language and Media, it says, "In today's rapidly changing environment, people have two main concerns: to discover the new problems this environment poses and to develop ways of coping with these problems." To time travel a little bit, in 1965, Marshall developed an essay called The Relation of Environment to Anti-Environment, in which he wrote, "The effects of the TV environment in altering the entire human character, sensibility and sensory ratios is entirely ignored. It is useful to notice all of the arts and sciences as acting in the role of anti-environments that enable us to perceive this environment. Through a careful and deliberate use of McLuhan quotations, I've tried to illustrate how the effects of technologies are environmental and how it is in the resulting environment which change happens. There is both an exterior and an interior environment to consider. Marshall talked about the personal and social consequences. These technologies affect us profoundly, in many ways physical and metaphysical. They rewire our very brains. They change the pattern of our thoughts. They alter our ability to concentrate, pay, and sustain attention. They alter our senses, heightening some and dulling others, creating new ratios and balances among them. They change how we think, how we act, how we communicate. They change how we relate to ourselves, how we see ourselves, our self-identity. They change how we relate to one another. They change relationships, relations. Media change everything. It is well to consider political speech in the age of social networks and big data because we are different people in the age of social networks and big data. There are two parts of speech, political or otherwise: the utterance and the audience, what is spoken and what is heard. Our environment shapes us, the political audience, the politician. It shapes political speech. What we are seeing in the realm of politics, the way in which politicians are speaking, are treating people, reflect both the environment and the audience. As our weather reflects our changing natural environment, so our politics and politicians reflect our rapidly changing technological environment, our rapidly changing selves. Muchas gracias.